morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. Today we continue reading A Prophet in Babylon with Chapter 22, A Tragedy. The anonymous letters had begun again. They had also become more definite in their threats and more vindictive in their character. Gaunt read them and laughed, but both Butler and Palmer regarded them as a grave menace. The exciting cause of these new threats was not far to seek. Butler had succeeded in his trenchant exposures in the daily light in arousing New York to one of those brief passions of reforming energy which are so characteristic of the volatile city. Public opinion had been roused and furnished with the necessary dynamic for the enforcement of law. There had been police raids of houses devoted to gambling and worse things. Saloons had been closed, and some of the worst offenders had been fined or sent to penitentiary. One result had been the enrollment of thousands of new members in the League of Service. Many men of influence, who cared relatively little for the religious aims of the League, recognized its social value and joined its ranks. The pulpits in the city rang with denunciations of public evils. Even the papers most hostile to Gaunt were silent, and others hitherto neutral had indulged in cautious commendation. But in the dark underworld of vice and crime, whose kingdom Gaunt had invaded, there was the growing murmur of conspiracy and retaliation. The old Ephesian cry rose, "Our craft is in danger!" And it was all the more to be dreaded, because it did not utter itself in public clamor, but in whispered wrath. In that dark and evil street where the mission stood and the sisters of the poor toiled, there were ominous signs of dissatisfaction. One night the windows of the hall were broken. On another night an attempt was made to fire the building. The Grey Sisters went about their work unmoved, but they noticed sadly that they now met more scowling than smiling faces. Butler knew the peril, but he recognized that the wisest way of meeting it was to show no sign of fear. For the first sign of fear is the coward's signal to attack. Palmer was more acutely conscious of the peril than Butler, and for this there was a reason in his growing love for Olivia Jordan. The figure of the fair girl filled his thoughts and often haunted his dreams. Again and again he woke in terror from the vision of her peril, but what could he do? She met his hinted fears with the confident and cheerful smile of a courageous child. Like Gaunt, she smiled at threats, and that indeed was the temper of all these tender women. "No one will hurt us," she said. "Our frailty is our protection." Palmer listened and began to understand why the records of martyrdom are so full of women's names. "You have disregarded our warnings," ran the latest anonymous letter. "You must now accept the consequences. The blow which we shall strike will be sudden and sure. You cannot escape it." Gaunt, Butler, and Palmer each read the letter in turn. They were seated at a table in the little room which Gaunt used for consultation and correspondence. "What do you make of it?" said Palmer anxiously. "It is of a piece with all the other letters," replied Butler. "They are written by one hand. This may mean that they simply express the intentions of an individual, or that they are the manifesto of a group of men. I suspect that the latter explanation is the true one." "Then you think that there is a conspiracy against us?" "I do, and more than that, it is not a conspiracy of ignorant men. If any attack is made upon us, it will no doubt be made by ignorant men, but they will be the tools of the intelligent and probably wealthy men." "And what can we do?" "Simply nothing, except sit tight," said Butler with a grim smile. "We can't wear chain armor under our clothes. It is out of fashion, and it would be a confession of weakness to invoke police protection. We must take our risks and be of good courage." About a week after this conversation, Gordon died. The old man had been busy until his last hour. After a long day's work he went to bed at midnight, and died in his sleep. When Gordon's will was opened, it was found to contain one curious clause. He requested that the only service held for him should be conducted in the mission hall, which was within a stone's throw of the hall in which he himself had preached 25 years before on his secession from the church. In his death he wished to be identified with the poor. He directed that his funeral should be of the plainest possible description, that his bearers should be 6 poor men chosen from the mission converts, that Gaunt should conduct any service of a public character that might be arranged, and finally he expressed the desire that those who had loved him would not be betrayed by their affections into speaking any words of adulation over one whose mistakes had been many, whose acts of wisdom few, whose sole claim to recollection was the sincerity of his unfulfilled intentions. "How like him," said Gaunt as he read the last instructions. "While most of us are filled with a lively sense of our value to society, I believe Gordon had not the least idea of what his life meant to the world." "He saw too widely to see himself," said Palmer. "He sees now the intention of his life fulfilled," replied Gaunt. Then each felt that any further words were sacrilege in the presence of that inscrutable and majestic mask of death. Gaunt sat long that night in the quiet room where the dead man had worked, busy in the examination of his papers. These papers consisted of fragments of autobiography, notes upon various scholastic and philosophic problems, prayers, meditations, and diaries. As Gaunt read each faded page, there came to him a new sense of the wonderful wealth of energy and wisdom compressed in such a life as Gordon's. And he remembered Palmer's saying that Gordon saw widely because he did not see himself. How rare was that temper! How few were those whose lives were not pivoted on egotism! He saw now what was the real secret of the majesty and sweetness of Gordon's character. It was his total self-effacement. He had striven, as all brave men must needs strive, for the things which they count worthy, but he had never made personal success his goal, or measured the worth of his quest by the degree of his success or failure. He had been so sure of the triumph of God's purpose that he had never imagined himself necessary to that triumph. Therefore he dwelt in peace, incapable alike of the intoxication of success or the depression of failure. And therefore also he had kept the prophetic vision, for only those who see not themselves can see God. Gaunt felt himself humbled before the testimony of Gordon's life. In the midnight silence he examined his own heart, and put to himself inevitable questions. Was not he in danger of this intoxication of success? Had not he unconsciously conceived himself as necessary to the fulfillment of God's intentions? He thought he recognized in himself what certainly no one had noticed, a certain coruscending of spiritual fiber since his cause had triumphed. It was not pride, it was not complacency. It was hard indeed to define it, unless as a certain dulling of the finer sensitiveness. Amid the agonies of his renunciation, when he let his old life go at the call of the truth, being conscious of rapturous moments of elation. They were moments when his naked soul clung close to God, knowing no other refuge. But it seemed to him that his clinging to God was less ardent now. Did not this imply that he saw God less clearly, because he had looked from God to himself? He realized now, as he meditated on Gordon's character, that those very qualities which had composed the noblest elements of that character were the products of outward failure. Fragrance from the bruised herb, wine from the crushed grape, a world's faith from the cross of desolation. So the story of the world's Redeemer had ever run. Assuredly, if that story of the tragic centuries was to be believed, success was the one fatal calamity in life, defeat the true redemption. Yet he could not honestly pray for defeat. He could not even ask for such a life as Gordon's, so far as its outward results went. But he saw now the thing he might pray for, and the goal he might strive for. It was complete self-effacement. He saw that he must no longer think of himself as necessary even to the movement which he led. No man was necessary to the divine purpose. He must count not his life dear unto him. He must be willing either to succeed or fail, to live or die, as God should decide. That was surely the last message of his great dead friend, which reached the heart of Gaunt in that midnight hour. He bowed silently beside the dead prophet, and rose purified and refreshed. In that intense hour Gordon preached the last sermon of his noble life. It was not preached in vain. The effect of those midnight thoughts was a new spirit of composure in Gaunt's mind. It was most clearly manifest in his attitude to the dangers that threatened him. Hitherto his attitude had been one of cheerful defiance. He had been ready to challenge the enemy. He had felt something of that thrill of elation which all strong and courageous men experience in the face of danger. His courage still remained, but all lust of battle had left him. He thought of his enemies with commiseration. It was their folly rather than their hatred which he saw. Things would happen as they would happen. As for him, he heard the mystic voice which said, "What is that to thee? Follow thou me." The following morning was spent in consultation upon the best method of carrying out Gordon's last wishes. Gordon's connection with the League of Service and his latter writings in which he had advocated its purposes had naturally given him notoriety. At the time of his death he was no longer a forgotten prophet, but rather a prophet who had come to his kingdom. Thus his death was a public event, and it was clear that it would be impossible to divest his funeral of a public character. "There are at least 5,000 of our people who will wish to show the last tokens of respect to Gordon," said Palmer. "In all probability you might treble that number, and it would be a safe estimate. The mission hall seats only 800. It might hold 1,000, he added. "That's not the only difficulty," said Gaunt. "Gordon wished to be numbered with the poor in his death. It is impossible to mistake his wishes. It would be entirely contrary to his wishes if we filled the hall with our friends and his, but shut out the poor." And that's the end of chapter 22, part A. Next week we'll continue with chapter 22, part B, as we continue a tragedy. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.